I don't recommend any psychedelics. I'm just telling you about these things, guys. Like, don't think that I'm recommending any of it. Should have put that at the beginning. Maybe I'll quickly cut this in at the beginning. Not recommending psychedelics here, guys. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind. Perhaps welcome for your first time. My name is James Jesso, and I'm the host here at the podcast. Normally, we do episodes where we have interviews. So we have a couple of different kinds of episodes. We have psychedelic cafes, which I haven't done in a little while, where we have a group of 5 to 7 different guests, and we do a variation on what's called the conversation cafe. It's sort of, if you can imagine having 7 people all sharing the same conversation coherently, that's what that is. Normally, though, we do regular interviews, interviews with various guests from across the wide interdisciplinary field of things that are relevant and related to psychedelic culture, medicine, and research. Sometimes we also have these little clips that come out, sometimes 10, sometimes 20-minute clips from previous episodes. Those are called micros. I'm telling you all of this because today's episode is going to be a bit different. It's not going to be a bit different. It's going to be extremely different. I'm actually going to be the only person talking on today's episode. Normally, I'm the host. I do a little intro, something like this, and then we get in the interview and I talk a bit, but I kind of try to position myself such that I don't take a backseat to the conversation. I take a front foot forward kind of position, but it's not so much to showcase my own ideas, but to help showcase the guest. So I share what I think is relevant in the conversation or I'm inspired to, but I really try to ensure that it showcases the guest predominantly. Today is just going to be me. And it's not going to be a... Sorry, I got a bit distracted by something coming on my screen. This is all going to be basically recorded in one go, other than if I have to take a bathroom break or something. So, have to forgive me that this is not as efficient and well cut together as normal. But today's just going to be me, not so much my own ideas, but a lecture that I'm going to give for you on psychedelics in general, sort of a larger scope of the landscape, the sort of surveying of the present landscape of psychedelics in research and practice, the name of this episode. Again, it's not so much my own ideas, as some of you might know. I have written multiple books. They're here on the shelf, and I have my own sort of theories on psychedelics. I'm presently writing my 3rd book now, which takes a lot of time, way more time than I thought it was going to. And like all things like this podcast, and the costs of hosting it and running it and paying for the software, paying for the hardware, it costs. So I guess this is my accidental lead-in to maybe you want to support the show in some way, support me and my work. Patreon. I'll get back into that later, so leave that aside. But today I'm going to talk about kind of just like a wider scale, a review of what's happening with a collection of different psychedelics in the modern psychedelic landscape, predominantly above ground. I'm not going to talk too much about anything happening too deep in the underground. I have quite a lot of awareness about these kinds of things. I sit on this cool middle ground where I get to speak with and have earned the trust of many above ground researchers and clinicians, and also the same for underground people, most of which don't end up on my show for obvious reasons of anonymity, confidentiality, and security. So I'm not going to talk about the underground stuff. I'm going to talk about a small collection of some of the most predominant psychedelics that are presently happening, presently in the field. The intention here is for this to be a introduction for a lot of you. If you're listening now, we're on episode 200. This is why I'm doing this thing, a special episode 200. A lot of you, this will be review, but hopefully good review. I'm also intending for it to be something that people who are new to all of this can just step in and listen to it and get a good sort of solid base on what's happening in the wider field of psychedelics. I initially put this lecture together. There's going to be a slideshow in a second. You'll be able to look at something more than just just this mug on the video screen. But I initially put this together when I was invited to teach a guest lecture at the University of Waterloo here where I live, Kitchener, Waterloo. And in sharing it with some of my patrons, the recording, and having to kind of rush through the end because I ran out of time, over-prepared, it turns out, they said, hey, why don't you re-record it and put it out for the podcast? I mean, this was an idea I had. I was like, what do you think? And they were like, yeah, let's do it. Or let's you do it. And here we are. So we're going to get into that in just a second. Again, it's not live, but I'm going to cut this as little as possible. So you're getting probably the most authentic me, I guess, than normal. Not that I'm inauthentic, disingenuous, but normally I'm trying to be much more like boom, 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 boom. Let's get into the podcast. Let's intro as short as possible while still staying relevant with all the information. Get into the intro or into the interview. And today I'm going to let myself be more relaxed. Hopefully that turns out well and it doesn't make you wonder like what the, fucking hell is this guy doing? Why is he rambling? And I'm going to have edited that one because I don't really want to create a NSF, not safe for work, NSFW podcast here outside of psychedelics. But anyways, okay, so I'm going to ramble. I'm going to ramble less. Again, this is special for the 200th episode. I've only once released a lecture I've given previously. It was episode 135 around psilocybin and compassion. And that was a recording of a lecture that I did. I believe it might have been either in England or Edinburgh, Scotland, or maybe another city in the UK. I don't remember, but I'll put a link to that up here on the little show notes or on a card here on YouTube if that's where you're watching it. So double check everything is recording properly while I get ready to go into the whole process here. And yeah, what do you say? Should we get into it? Okay, as you can see up on the screen, I got some slides. I've also got some tasty coffee. I'll be editing out all the weird mouth noises there. And as I said, today we're going to be talking about psychedelics in research and practice. Now, if you're a listener to the show, you probably know a bit about me already, but it was in the lecture series or in the slideshow, so we'll go with it here. And I'll introduce myself as James Jesso. I'm the host of this podcast you're listening to now. I've written a couple of books. Like I said, they're on the shelf here beside me. Decomposing the Shadow, Lessons from the Psilocybin Mushroom, and The True Light of Darkness. They're both discussing the same topics, which are, a model that I created or forged out of my journeys with psilocybin many years ago, more than a decade ago, where I worked with psilocybin to bring my life back together after having made a mess of it and ended up in a really tough mental health place about 10 years ago. And this was long before there was a whole lot of talk about psilocybin for mental health or giving it a psychotherapeutic sort of framework to think about these experiences or talking about emotional repression or feeling processes and so on and so forth. That's a lot of what Decomposing the Shadow offers. It's a kind of model for understanding and engaging the experience for this kind of like personal healing, psychological, emotional, and spiritual. And I put that together before it became popular, before it was on CNN, before I was on Fox News, for example, that these things were being talked about. And it's a very academic piece of work, scholarly, essay-like, nonfiction. The True Light of Darkness explores the same topic, but it does so from a storytelling narrative. It does so while sort of sharing the living experiences, the actual basically trip reports of journeys that I went on, and how the decomposing the shadow motto played out in how I understood, experienced, and integrated these experiences, these journeys with psilocybin. I like to refer to decomposing the shadow kind of like the skeleton, and the true light of darkness kind of like the living body. If you're more into novels, you'd be more into the true light of darkness. If you're more into sort of like self-help style nonfiction, you'd probably be more into decomposing the shadow. So that's that. That's not what we're talking about today, but consider that a little plug. You could support my work in the podcast by buying a book. But today, what we're going to do, these are the psychedelics we're going to be talking about today, and I'm going to clarify why I've got Ibogaine and MDMA and ketamine on there when technically they would not, in my opinion, generally qualify as a psychedelic. But this is what we're going to go through. We're going to talk about psilocybin, DMT, MDMA, Ibogaine, and ketamine. Now, a caveat here is that this is obviously a huge subject. Every single one of these, first off, this is a small subsection of the sort of potential psychedelics we could talk about that are, already have a long-standing history and a lot of research behind them, such as LSD or mescaline, the ones that we're not going to talk about today. So not only are this list sort of small compared to the wider landscape of psychedelics, each of the pieces that we're going to talk about are just a small slice of each of these topics. So if there's anything in this that you find interesting that you want expanded upon, you could always contact me and I can send you links to maybe episodes that I've done that expands more on certain topics and so on and so forth. I'd love to engage people in comments. So if you're doing this on YouTube or Spotify and you can leave comments, I'll do my best to engage intelligently. And as long as they're not like shitty comments, in which case I'll probably have like a salty response for you. But so keep in mind, this is a huge subject. We're barely going to scratch the surface today, despite the fact that we're almost definitely going to be more than 2 hours into this. The other thing is that I'm not going to talk quite a lot about the harms that these substances can introduce, from psychological harms to physical harms, to harms of addiction, which is present not so much in DMT and psilocybin, but or certainly not with Ibogaine, but we'll talk about that, but can be present with ketamine and MDMA. So I'm not going to talk about some of these harms, but just know that as I talk about them, like fire can warm a house or heat your food, it can also absolutely obliterate everything you've ever worked for until your entire life and is in literal crumbled shambles. So psychedelics can be like that too. So keep that in mind. Now, as we're going to get into it, here are the things that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about in each of these molecules, we're going to talk about pharmacology, some of the history, some about the experience, and some of the current research and clinical use. But before we get into that, we're going to talk about exactly what is a psychedelic. The term psychedelic means mind or soul manifesting. It comes from the Greek psyche, meaning mind or soul, and delios, meaning to reveal or to manifest. So together you have these mind manifesting drugs. There's a fun little historical story there around how this term came up and a conversation between Aldous Huxley and Canadian psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond, but I'll leave that to your Googling because I don't remember the exact quote and I didn't write it down. I don't want to mess it up. But generally, that's what the term psychedelic means. And it is applied to a group of psychoactive compounds that produce altered states of consciousness, or what you would call trips or journeys. Now, when I say altered state of consciousness, anything we take alters our state of consciousness. Like I am drinking a coffee right now. This is altering my state of consciousness. If I were to consume nicotine, alter my state of consciousness. Cannabis, alter my state of consciousness. Alcohol, alter my state of consciousness. So when I say that they alter our state of consciousness, I mean this in a pretty unique and interesting way. It is not as though we just sort of like shift into sort of different kind of like subtle nuances in our normal state, or even more significant nuances in the case of alcohol, for example. I'm talking about entering into states of awareness, states of consciousness that differ at times so dramatically from our baseline awareness, baseline state of being, that they become nearly unrecognizable to what we would experience as reality in baseline. So, what I mean by this is there are aesthetic alterations, there are alterations in how we see things. Color can become more intense, the play of light and shadow can become more intense, but then visually more things can happen, what's called open or closed eyes visuals, where all of a sudden we start to see patterns or colors in empty space. Behind our closed eyes, we might see all sorts of sort of a visual play of material. It could be very metaphorical, like scenes, like watching a play unfold as if you were really there, or these highly complex sort of geometric images that, again, eyes close or eyes open. Sometimes, for example, if you see this photo here from Alex Gray, this painting from Alex Gray, one of my favorites, it's a really great example of how profound the visual alterations can be. This is a pretty good rendition of what it can be like when we're under a full effects of the visual alterations of psychedelics. Again, so we can have these subjective scenes in the mind's eye or these patterns. We also have experiences where, and we'll get in a little bit more about this in a bit, but we have the experience of the normal sort of invisible walls that temper our emotionality, keep content normally reserved for the subconscious or unconscious mind sort of down. These walls can dissolve, and things that we hold within us that normally we can't access or won't access or don't access come to the forefront of awareness in ways that can be quite intense, quite sort of full bodied literally, but also in the sense of fully immersive. And this can be memories, like I said, scenes, and they can even at some points go beyond what feels to be personal memories. There are experiences people can have where they enter into states of consciousness where they experience what seems like memories of other people or whole cultures or whole species or the whole arc of evolution on this planet, as though that individual was living it out as their subjective experience. The entire arc of evolution on this planet is their subjective experience happening within a moment or a few moments or an arc in their psychedelic experience. There's also the possibility to, in these experiences, have what's called a mystical or a spiritual experience, where one genuinely has the sense of connecting with a greater power. The sense of, say, for the term God, for example, or universe or spirit or etc. People have a direct, genuine, authentic, at least experientially, connection with this force in the universe, whatever it might be. And these tend to be very powerful, meaningful experiences. Another thing that psychedelics can do, which is quite interesting, is what's called sort of self, like the dissolution of the self, or ego dissolution or ego death. Ego death is a pretty extreme term, but effectively what we're talking about here is, when I said that psychedelics can dissolve the invisible walls that temper our emotionality and keep certain, internal content suppressed so that it does not necessarily too dramatically dilute or defer from our capacity to perceive like objective reality around us. One of the things that can dissolve is the sort of the model that's ongoingly operating within us that is our self-representation. The fact that I am a being, a James, for example, that has a particular sort of position of perspective. I know where I am and where other starts. I'm separate from this water bottle. I'm separate from this camera. I'm separate from the air around me or life on the other side of the planet or from the past or from the future. I'm separate from this, and I have a clear sense of who I am. I am me. I mean, it varies from day to day whether or not I have a clear sense of what that is, but I mean, we all have this general sense, if we're in a healthy state of mind, as having a solid me. At different levels of intensity and at different doses of different psychedelics, we can have the experience of the models that hold that self-representation together dissolving away. And it feels as though I am not me anymore, or me is gone. I am this bottle. I am this mic. I am you. I am life. I am all that has ever been all at once. We can have these experiences, and oftentimes during the experience, these are generally related to high mystical or spiritual type experiences. When we lose our sense of self, it goes away, and we encounter a connection with something greater than, that we are also a part of, an expression of, and the totality of this larger force. But it can also feel like dying, because in a way, me is dying in that sense. It's dissolving away. So that's why it generally gets to be called ego death. This is something that's quite unique to psychedelic drugs, that they can do this. And so we'll talk a bit about why and how they do that, or at least what we understand about why and how they do that. But I want to clarify that these experiences can range. Even the sort of ego dissolution, ego softening, so on and so forth. It's not always so dramatic as I am dying and I am being, as I die, my sense of I is being reborn onto a larger force in the universe. It can be as subtle as the sort of like the confines, the strong grips that I have around who I identify as being can be softened, such that new identities, new sort of models for how I understand myself can emerge. For example, how much I relate to myself with nature, which we'll talk about with respect to psilocybin in a bit, or how much I hold on to a particular ideal, or how much of my identity is forged into a particular political ideology. These things can shift and change, like that aspect can soften. And so these are some of the kinds of experiences we can have. They can range from playful and recreational. They can go into the deeply therapeutic, because when we talk about these aesthetic things, when we talk about these aesthetic changes, they can be very interesting and curious. And a lot of psychedelic use is very much in the recreational sort of entertainment, camp. And I don't have any issues with that necessarily. It's not necessarily the safest way to do it, but there's a lot of playfulness. Even in therapeutic experience can be playfulness. When I talk about therapeutic, this is where, with experiencing these memories or these old feelings, or connecting with, a new way of understanding ourselves, or it allows us to undergo these, what people often call as like deeply healing experiences. And in the context of therapeutic support, and by this I mean a therapeutic facilitator or a ceremonial facilitator, we can deepen into those therapeutic aspects. It could also go as far as being profoundly spiritual, like I said before. They can range as well from acutely pleasant, like really pleasant, even like sexually, sensually pleasant, to extremely unpleasant, heightened states of anxiety, fear, panic, terror, hell without escape. This is how far, like merging into like sensual orgasmic union with the universe, as we sort of like explode into everything in life and its absolute beauty, to hellish, like hell with no escape, like infinite demonic suffering. Like they can go that far in their sort of valence. They can also have positive or negative consequences. We could have a really challenging experiences that have really positive consequences in our lives. We could have really positive experiences that have neutral consequences. We could have experiences that have negative consequences, such as harms that could come from it, or confusing us, or just like, so there's so much variability here. And whether or not the positive or negative outcome is not defined by the acute sort of experience. Like I said, negative outcomes can have positive consequences. And this is something else that's unique to psychedelics, which is that the effects are significantly mediated by contextual factors. What that means is that, if I take a Tylenol, or if you maybe it's paracetamol or wherever else, if I take acetaminophen, I know that I take this drug, it's going to have a particular effect. There might be some variation depending on my unique sort of genome and my physiology as to how it's going to affect me. But for the most part, it's going to be pretty stable. I'm going to take Tylenol, it's going to have a pain relieving effect. Or I'm going to drink alcohol and it's going to have an inebriating effect that is pretty, I might be more playful or more depressed depending on how I'm feeling and where I'm at. But for the most part, it's pretty stable. With psychedelics, the context, which would be our internal context or mindset context, what we're coming in with, what we believe about the psychedelics and narratives we have about these drugs or what they can offer us, the concepts we have on board to understand our experiences, the feelings we're going in with, the history that we're going into with, that would be our internal context. And the external context, like where we are, who we're with, what's present or absent in the room, and then also the context of dose, the variability of how intense and like far out the experience can take us, also can be significantly mediated by how much the dose is. So these three factors, which are often called set, setting, and dose, they can have such wide-ranging differences that between different, outside of some universal characteristics that are pretty similar between each molecule, different people can have widely different experiences on totally different journey days. So it's heavily mediated by context. Whether or not it's going to be profoundly spiritual or just playful and recreational is something that you can reasonably sort of modulate by the context that you take it in. Now, that's not a hard line. Sometimes people take mushrooms at a festival and they meet God and their lives are changed. And sometimes people go into a ceremony to have a deeply spiritual experience and all they get is just like rehashing of all the reels that they consumed 3 or 4 days before. So it's not 100% definite, but it's true that they're highly mediated by context, unlike other drugs. The other thing that is interesting about psychedelics that is part of what, and we'll talk about in a second, defines them as psychedelics is that they tend to target predominantly, or at least the psychedelic effects, seems to predominantly be through their impact on what's called the serotonin 5-HT2A receptors, and that the modulation of those receptors seems to be responsible for the psychedelic effects, such as, like I said, I think I said alterations in aesthetic experience, so patterns, colors, also feelings. Part of what that is an increase of sensory awareness. Again, this is totally off the cuff, so if I'm rambling, you're going to have to forgive me. I drank a big coffee, afraid that I wouldn't say enough, and I might be saying too much. But so that's a general sense of what is a psychedelic. Now, another question is like, what makes them so interesting to research? I mean, maybe you already know this. Again, I gave this talk for, I think, second year cognitive neuroscience students. So I broke it down into 3 different sort of avenues or 3 different domains that they would be that makes them interesting to research. One is that from the perspective of cognitive neuroscience, when we have a molecule that we can give to somebody and we can reliably take them into extremely different states of consciousness, we're able to better understand those states, like what is happening in the brain when those states are being triggered, but we could also get a better understanding of baseline consciousness. If we know what it is that's triggering these significant changes into altered states of consciousness, we get a better understanding of what is involved in sustaining baseline consciousness. So we get a better understanding of what would be called the neurological correlates of consciousness. Correlates, neurological as it's in the brain, correlates because it's correlated. I imagine some of you have a more physicalist perspective, or maybe some of you have a more idealist perspective, but where the cause and effect is here. Like, does brain cause consciousness? Does consciousness cause brain? That question is irrelevant here. Well, it's not irrelevant, but it's not what I'm speaking to here. When I say neurological correlates of consciousness, what we know is regardless of what sort of direction the causal flow is going, when we alter the brain, we see things happening in the brain. when we see baseline states, when we see psychedelic states, different things are happening in the brain. Certain functions and firing patterns are correlated with baseline, correlated with psychedelic states. So that's why we call them the neurological correlates of consciousness, which of course can be incredibly interesting for people to research, giving us a better understanding of the brain, of awareness, of consciousness, and of, in many ways, like healing and therapy when we look at how these can be utilized in therapy. Now, from a philosophical perspective, we have these drugs that can reliably trigger such incredibly different states of awareness that it creates an opportunity to philosophically, through experimentation, enter into, explore, like, what is consciousness? What is this place? Where are we going? What does it say about where we are when we can take a drug to go there? And we can have these like interesting explorations of, philosophically, the human experience through the analysis of the subjective reports or from the subjective experiences of taking psychedelics. Now, from a therapeutic perspective, what is interesting about the research here is that many like anecdotal reports and ongoing sort of like clinical and experimental studies are showing that these drugs used in, certain contexts, not to say that this doesn't happen outside of those contexts, but we can increasingly say that used in these particular contexts, these substances can reliably treat or have potential treatment for many different psychiatric and neurodegenerative disorders that we otherwise have very poor treatments for, or we have no treatments for. So in that sense, they're incredibly interesting to research for these three reasons. Now, unfortunately, they're also illegal. And I say this unfortunately because I personally am more inclined to believe in these substances being at minimum decriminalized, if not legalized, although that perspective for me is really, it's highly dependent on public education. I think basically any and all drugs could be pretty much legal and accessible to people if we had good education and good sort of healthcare around helping people make positive choices, not just in harm reduction, but benefit optimization, what Emmanuel Spheros used to call being drug positive, as a correlation to sex positive. But that's nonetheless. The point is that these drugs were widely made illegal on the federal level in the United States, despite the fact that in the 60s, not all of them, but especially substances like LSD were becoming incredibly, and MDMA later in the 80s, but they became incredibly popular with research and with clinicians because of these effects. But unfortunately, so the story goes, the kind of like, quote, escaping the lab of LSD and the impact that had on the counterculture and particularly anti-war movement in the 60s, resulted in President Nixon signing the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act in 1970, criminalizing these drugs, which then spread internationally through the UN Convention of Psychotropic Substances back in 1971. Most of them widely remain illegal today, outside of certain circumstances. Basically because modern research managed to sort of open the door on doing the research, and it is increasingly showing these incredible benefits for therapy, that there is renewed access being gained, not just through research settings, but also through clinical settings in different countries. So basically the evidence that we're building here for safety and efficacy in therapeutic treatment is making for greater inclusion or access through what's called like the medical track, the medical legalization track. For example, various states in the USA have different sort of states, and even cities have different laws about accessing these drugs, such as decriminalizations in Denver, Colorado, or a state level legislation that allows for what's called psilocybin services in Oregon. Australia made, I believe, psilocybin therapy legal-ish. I don't know the details on that in 2023, although approval on that is quite slow. Here in Canada, there's it's not federally legal or even provincially legal or any of that, but we do have a growing movement where access for psilocybin therapy in particular for patients as well as providers are being made available through what's called the Section 56 Special Access Program, where drugs that aren't approved can be given to people in dire circumstances. So we have that happening for greater access despite them remaining illegal. On top of that, we have a strong decriminalization movement. I already mentioned Denver, Colorado, for example, but there are other cities that have decriminalized it where you're just not going to get in trouble for having it, but it has also created the presence of a gray market. So the term black market obviously has like weird racial connotations, so I prefer kind of like legacy market or underground market. This is when you like text your drug dealer and they get you the illegal drugs. That would be like the underground market. And then if you say like the above ground market, you can walk into a store and buy it. You imagine like every time you go to the pharmacy, you are operating in the above ground market, whether it's over the counter or behind the counter. You're operating in the above ground market. The gray market is where things are still pretty illegal, but you don't have to like text your drug dealer or do anything too sketchy to get it. So for example, despite it being illegal, there are a lot of places that you can buy microdoses online or just straight up buy mushrooms, like mushroom dispensaries. Or I keep getting targeted ads on Facebook, which might be scams, but like targeted ads that are literally trying to sell me just like pure crystal MDMA right on the regular open web. And there's even physical mushroom dispensaries. There are some in Vancouver, Canada, for example. There used to be multiple ones in our city, but the city was wasting tens and tens of thousands of public dollars closing it down over and over again, despite that it was causing absolutely no harm whatsoever in the city until I guess they stopped reopening it. Personally, I think that was a massive waste of public funds, unnecessary, but that's trying not to get too much on my soapbox there. But nonetheless, here we are. They are illegal mostly in most places, except in certain circumstances, and progressively that is changing. Now, earlier I had mentioned that between the substances that we're talking about here today, we've got psilocybin, MDMA, ketamine, DMT, Ibogaine, that I said some of them aren't really psychedelics, but I'm grouping them all under psychedelics. The reason I'm doing that, and I'm taking a sort of taking this from Nolan Williams, who's a researcher at, I believe, Stanford Medicine. He was on the podcast to talk about Ibogaine. I'll mention him again a bit later. And he had mentioned this idea of splitters versus lumpers, where a splitter would say, well, a psychedelic technically is only a psychedelic, which are classical psychedelics, are the ones that affect the serotonin 5-HT2A receptor. Those are psychedelics. Anything that doesn't have its primary consciousness altering effect through that subreceptor is not technically a psychedelic. MDMA would not count. Ketamine would not count. Ibogaine would not count. Lumpers would say, well, sure, technically yes, but we can just generally just call them psychedelics, and we'll just call it psychedelic research, and it's not so egregious to sort of lump them in together because they all kind of like sit in the same movement at least, and they have similar enough experiences to say, let's just call them psychedelics. I am more inclined to be on the splitter side of things, but for the purpose of this lecture, we're doing the lumper side. Now, that said, the first substance we're going to talk about today is technically, under the splitter terminology, a psychedelic. We're going to be talking first about psilocybin, or 4-phosphoryloxy N,-dimethyltryptamine. Psilocybin is the active ingredient in what is called magic mushrooms. I like that term. Some people don't. There are more than 200 different species of magic mushrooms that exist around the globe in every continent except for Antarctica, as far as I know, growing wild in a range of different mushrooms, not just one genus, for example, multiple different genuses that developed or got the what's called the biosynthetic pathway for producing the molecules that include psilocybin, called psiloids, that produce these effects. Got them through horizontal gene transfer like millions of years ago. This is crazy. So anyways, it's very widespread across the entire globe, across a bunch of different species and different genuses of mushrooms. The one that I understand to be the oldest would be, and the most prolific would be the Psilocybe genus, and they developed the biosynthetic pathway for the production of psiloids such as psilocybin back like 65 million years ago, like long ass time. Psilocybin is a tryptamine alkaloid. Now, I'm really heavily leaning into my notes here because I'm not an organic chemist, so I'm going to explain this the way I understand it, but you have to keep in mind that I'm not much of a professional or authority on this. But a tryptamine alkaloid, so first off, an alkaloid is a nitrogen-containing compound that is often biologically active, which means it interacts with our nervous system. Common alkaloids that I'm sure many of you have or are presently under the influence of would be something like caffeine or nicotine. Other alkaloids include things like morphine and quinine, which is the compound I believe they use to treat malaria or prevent malaria. Tryptamines are a family of alkaloids. Their molecular structure is built around a particular shape called the indole ring system. You can consider where like different tryptamines as being like slight variations on this ring system, this indole ring system, like jazz variations on a theme. And these variations can range dramatically and create different effects on the mind and nervous system, from complete inactivity to 1,000-fold increases in potency. What I mean by this is you could have a basic indole ring structure, a tryptamine alkaloid, that looks almost identical to another one, but a slight variation creates, like I said, complete inactivity or 1,000-fold increases in potency. Additionally, the tryptamine alkaloid's core structure tends to be very similar to serotonin, which is why classical psychedelics, which are those that would be a splitters group of psychedelics, those that affect the 5-HT2A receptor, are generally considered or often described as serotonin analogs. Psilocybin is a prodrug, which means that it's a prodrug to psilocin, or 4-hydroxy-NN-DMT, 4-HO-DMT. A prodrug means that we take this drug and it turns into another drug. So psilocybin doesn't actually do anything to you in your brain. Oh my God, psilocin does. So you take psilocybin, it converts to psilocin. Psilocin creates these effects that we know as psychedelic, as the psychedelic effects of psilocybin. And well, what are those effects? Like I said, it binds predominantly to the 5-HT2A receptor, which changes firing patterns in neural networks. So our brain is a sort of incredible system of multiple networks of relationships and firing patterns that all sort of work in tandem with each other. And when we alter those firing patterns, when we alter the functioning of those networks, we alter experience, we alter consciousness. Theoretically, you could also say that when we alter our states of awareness, we're altering those firing patterns. At least from the sort of theory that is out on how these things are affecting and changing consciousness, psilocybin is said to affect what's called the default mode network, the DMN. The default mode network is basically what's happening where you are in your brain when you're not doing anything in particular. It is the sort of like random thought generations that just unfold when you're not particularly engaged in like what's called like the task positive network. I'm in the task positive network right now by talking to you. I'm engaging in a task. If I were to just sit here and let my mind wander, I would be entering into the default mode network. The salience network is what jumps us between it, I believe. When we So basically, it's what's happening when we're at rest and we have no explicit cognitive tasks. The default mode network kind of shapes our sense of time, our sense of space, and our sense of self. When we imagine like what is our what it is to feel like to be me, if I ask that question and we go into task positive exploration of that question, we might come up with a lot of answers, or maybe not as many answers as we hope we could. But when we're just at rest, it's like the thoughts, feelings, emotions. It's the things that just run through our mind that kind of like they become the background of experience that becomes the sort of like not always consciously, not always uh, consciously aware aspects of our mind that we define and experience as ourselves. That default mode network, our sense of self, right, also influences the self-other relationship, because our defined sense of space, time, and self influences the parameters, the sort of like dividing lines by which then all things become other. Past self, all things become other. Okay? So when we have this reduction in the default mode network that psilocybin seems to do, that is where we start to get those effects that I talked of earlier. We get the increases in sensory awareness, we get the changes in sort of aesthetic, but we also get the sort of dissolution of those invisible walls that allow certain things to come up, because the default mode network also kind of works to hold things in a particular way. We get things that arise, we get changes in our sense of self, we get even the experience of our sense of self dissolving away. Part of what happens when it's changing the sort of firing pattern, so it alters blood flow in the brain, psilocin does. It changes firing patterns such that the sort of normal direction that things would flow through sensory experience into conscious awareness and understanding of like models and like what we understand things to be and what we perceive them to be and what they, are tangibly in our sensory experience, that sort of normal flow changes, and parts of the brain that normally don't communicate with each other start to communicate with each other. And certain aspects of the brain that normally would be sort of like sub-perceptual or like sort of outside of conscious awareness, because of the change in these blood flow and firing patterns between the communication between these networks, they start to sort of take a stronger or more dominant place in our conscious awareness. So I have this picture up here, which is from the Homological Scaffolds of Brain Functional Networks, a paper from 2014, where you can see on the left is them sort of creating a pretty visual representation of the sort of network intercommunications between networks functioning in the brain. Sober, that would be A, or the left, and then on psilocybin, or psilocybin, in B, and you can see, wow, that's a lot more communication. Now, historically, discussing psilocybin's history is just way too big to do it justice, but what we can say is that psilocybin-containing mushrooms at least were brought to the modern eye thanks to Valentina and R. Gordon Wasson back in 1955. They were introduced to, I believe it was Psilocybe mexicana or Psilocybe mazatepic, or maybe it's celerescens. It doesn't matter. They were introduced to these psilocybin-containing mushrooms through the indigenous healer Maria Sabina during some mycological research they were doing in southern Mexico. Now, the story there is just so interesting and so complex and at times quite contentious, and I would highly recommend you look into it. It is very interesting. But nonetheless, that is how we became popularly aware of psilocybin-containing mushrooms, because I believe this was a violation of his agreement with Maria Sabina, but Wasson then went out and wrote an article about this, showing her pictures. This is the picture in the middle there, and other information in the Life magazine, which exploded it around the world. Now, historically, what we know about their use in Mexico is that psilocybin-containing mushrooms have been historically used by the indigenous people in Mexico. What we know now, predominantly the Mazatec people, who are at least still using it, or at least were using it in recent memory, but could go back as far as the Aztec people, who called them Teonatacatl, meaning the flesh of the gods, perhaps even as far back as the Olmec people, which are very like the ancient peoples of the land that we now call Mexico. The indigenous use of this mushroom was basically pushed underground due to suppression by way of the Spanish colonizers, which obviously is not good in a lot of ways, but is complex because, it wasn't necessarily without cause. Like the Aztec people were using these mushrooms in ceremonies that included basically human sacrifice while under the influence. And I'm sure there was a lot of use that was not so awful or not so involved with such awful stuff. But the use of mushrooms and human sacrifice and violence was pretty present, at least in the Aztec people. So the part of what pushed the suppression of their use by way of the Spanish colonizers and the sort of like expectations of, I don't know if it was the king or the queen of Spain at the time, and their sort of like Christian ideals, probably not great in some ways, also did have an influence on suppressing human sacrifice, which is probably good. But don't cancel me. I don't know, right? I'm open to different perspectives on that. So on the left, you see a depiction of a statue which was found in a tomb. I don't remember, but in Mexico, and it is of the god Chotepili. You have to pardon me. I don't speak, I believe, Nahuatl, which is the name of the language here. And according to Wikipedia, he was the god of beauty, love, passion, sex, sexuality, fertility, art, song, dance, music, painting, writing, games, playfulness, nature, vegetation, and flowers in Aztec mythology. Like, dude was a Renaissance man. It's not the right term, but clearly quite a dynamic representation, dynamic god. He was also considered to be the patron of homosexuality and male prostitutes. But he is also considered to maybe have been specifically sort of a representation of working with psychoactive plants, because this statue that you see here has depictions of different psychoactive plants. Specifically, it's got the psilocybin mushroom cap. It's got the morning glory, which contains the chemical very similar to LSD, and the nicotine flower, and I'm not sure those other ones. So that being said, as for the history of psilocybin, we also have what's called the stoned ape theory. Contentious, interesting timeline. I think is pretty good. If psilocybin's been around 65 million years, but effectively, as you can see on the picture from on the right, also from Alex Gray, is the idea that psilocybin mushrooms were involved in the development or the evolution of the human brain such that we became self-aware creatures, that we discovered these mushrooms on the African savanna when it was more of a wet land, I guess, and that upon eating them, we discovered something that ended up having us be more inclined to keep eating them, and we ate them for a period of time, and they had some sort of effect on our brain, which then helped forward our evolution into the self-aware creatures that we are now. Again, contentious, but if we're going to talk about the history of psilocybin, it's important to point out that this is a theory that many people think is reasonably-ish plausible. Now, in terms of its present use and where it's at in clinical and research, we have found that psilocybin can produce classically defined mystical experiences, which is effectively to say that if we give a sufficient enough dose of psilocybin to someone, there's a very high likelihood that they will have an experience that, when described, fits enough of the qualities of what we would call a mystical experience as defined by classical mystical texts to say that that was a mystical experience, which is to say it matches the characteristics of these experiences as it was represented in religious and mystical texts. We know that people generally, from the research, rate their psilocybin experiences as in the top 5 most meaningful experiences of their life, next to the death of a parent or the birth of their first child. We know that in clinical practice, there's some evidence for it in a psilocybin therapy session. You could see a picture there from, I think it's John Hopkins, of a psilocybin therapy session, that they're able to seemingly have profoundly positive therapeutic effects for treating things like depression, end of life distress, which is effectively when we're distressed, having anxiety, depression, and fear, and panic, and all the rest for the fact that we're dying, for anorexia, for smoking cessation, for obsessive compulsive disorder. But we have some other interesting things, which is that part of the consequences of consuming psilocybin, other psychedelics are in this camp, but psilocybin in particular for this example, is that it has an effect on effectively the brain's capacity to alter its own, basically to alter its connectivity. Well, we saw the connectivity, that picture of like rapid, more connectivity under the influence, but it also increases what is called neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change itself, as well as provides an uptick in the sort of compounds or the proteins, the neural proteins necessary to make changes in how the brain is kind of laid out. It would be like the functional connectivity, perhaps even the structural connectivity, changing the physical connections. Why that's interesting is because, well, that's likely involved in its therapeutic effects, but it also has shown it might be involved with why it is that psilocybin seems to have such a profound effect on things like traumatic brain injury. When we have a traumatic brain injury, our brain is damaged. You might not know it from this talk, but I know well what a traumatic brain injury is like. I've had, unfortunately, a couple of them, and the last one I had has really negatively impacted my life in a very significant way. And I am not the same person. But anyway, so after a traumatic brain injury, your brain doesn't get back the damage. Like it doesn't, pardon that sound, it doesn't repair the damaged neurons. What it does is it remaps. Same with a stroke. When we rehabilitate from a stroke, we don't sort of heal the damaged neurons. They're gone forever for the most part, as far as we know. What we do is we change the structure of the brain such that it can start to adapt and compensate for the lost neurons to regain function. So, for example, if I had a particular pathway that allowed me to speak eloquently and poetically, and that got sheared off and those neurons damaged either through the direct impact or through the secondary injury of ongoing neural inflammation of a traumatic brain injury, that I would never be able to get that back, but I could relearn it such that new pathways could come in to help approximate something akin to it. So this is one of the reasons why we're seeing psilocybin for traumatic brain injury. Also interesting, and I don't have a lot of details on that, but I do have a podcast about it, which I'll link here with Bob Wold, is that psilocybin along with LSD also seems to help interrupt or prevent what's called a cluster headache, or some call suicide headaches because they're so bad people would rather be dead or literally try to knock themselves unconscious just so they don't have to experience the pain. And seemingly nothing works to make this not happen except psychedelics. It's crazy and incredible. I'll leave a link to that so if you want to follow up more, but they seem to help with treating cluster headaches. And also quite interestingly and uniquely psilocybin is that it seems to increase nature connection. By this, I mean that it increases our sense of being connected with nature, our sense of feeling like we are a part of nature and nature is a part of us, how we experience being in nature, what our perspectives are towards how nature should be treated. It has a significant impact in that seems to be unique amongst all the psychedelics, psilocybin. And as that, some people are starting to suggest that it might be a potential climate change intervention at the individual level. If we go back towards another podcast I did with a man named John Seed, he talks about deep ecology. I've also had someone else on the podcast, Sky Otter, talking about deep ecology. The idea is that instead of trying to change the way we're conducting ourselves with the natural world, with the environment, at the political level, at the top down sort of like legislation into individual level, to sort of bring it from the individual level up by not just by basically changing how we identify and relate with nature, not by changing just our behaviors, but our deep identifications with the natural world. Psilocybin seems to help do that. So, wow, we are 51 minutes in, guys and gals and others. And we are only at number 1 of like 5. So, wow. I might need to take another break to re-up this coffee. But let's move on to the next one. The next one we've got is DMT, N-dimethyltryptamine. So earlier we described psilocybin has dimethyltryptamine in it. Well, another way to say that is that the base structure of psilocybin is a sort of variation on a theme of DMT. So psilocybin, psilocin are kind of like variations of DMT. DMT also is a tryptamine and is one of the most simple tryptamines, being structurally extremely similar to serotonin, nearly identical. As you can see here, okay, so something that is, okay, well, hold on. I'm getting a little flushed because I'm getting excited to talk about this one. DMT is a tryptamine alkaloid. It is a classical psychedelics, predominantly affecting the 5-HT2A receptor, but it also affects a bunch of other receptors. 1A, 1B, 1D, 1E, 2B, 2C, and so on. It also affects the sigma-1 receptor and adrenergic receptors. I don't entirely understand what all of that means, but it will be relevant in a second when we'll talk about their DMT's potential therapeutic effects. DMT is naturally present in it is rampant in the natural world. I believe it was Dennis McKenna, a famous ethnobotanist, who said something to the effect of, it would be easier to identify all the plants that don't have DMT than all the ones that do, because it is so rampant in the world. There's also some evidence to suggest that it is theoretically present in the human brain and might have some role in certain aspects of our experience, although that is quite contentious. I know that it is generally strongly believed in the underground as being the case, but scientifically, jury is out on that. What it is, though, is it's incredibly potent. So what DMT does is incredibly powerful and potent. It is near instantaneous alterations of consciousness that at what's called a breakthrough dose, which means you get fully into the experience, can take you into such a profound alteration of perception that we experience ourselves as being in a completely different reality that operates on sort of time and sort of dimensional physics that are almost contrary to normal states of consciousness, to what we normally experience as reality. It is generally populated it generally includes those incredibly complex geometric imagery. If you're watching this on video, you see I have a painting here, a drawing from Salvia Droid, who I believe to be Terence McKenna, Dennis McKenna's brother, a famous sort of like poet, author, public speaker who talked a lot about psychedelics. And the sort of this visual representation is like pretty close to what it feels like to smoke DMT. And we go into these impossible spaces, and yet we're gone and back sometimes within 5 or 6 minutes. That can be extended. I don't know if I talk about extended state DMT, but we'll get in. If I do, great. And if not, I'll leave a cue somewhere for a guest that I had talking about extended state DMT. But we go to these incredible places that at times where we're in it can feel like we're there for hours or lifetimes. And yet we're actually gone for 5 or 10 minutes. So it has notably intense perceptual distortions, incredibly powerful, incredibly potent. We're talking like 40 to 50 milligrams of this thing to go into a completely different dimension of reality. And yet we're back within a few minutes. This is what I think back in the 60s, they used to call it the businessman's trip, because you could have a full psychedelic experience on your lunch break. Now, something else, or another one, psychedelic bungee jumping. Terrible term, great term. Something else that's interesting about DMT, and it is present with psilocybin to a lesser degree, is that one of the defining features, it's not universally present, but it's like pretty close, is that we experience encounters with entities. By this, I mean, we enter into this experience, we go into a totally different reality, and while we're there, it appears as though that reality we're in is populated. It is populated by other intelligent beings. that are separate from us, at least seemingly. They are separate from us, and we interact with them. They interact with us. They try to communicate with us. We try as Terence McKenna said, to not give in to astonishment. And it's incredibly interesting and odd when we think about, philosophically, the study of these psychedelics. Like, are we interacting with other entities? Like, are these aliens? Is this how the aliens are talking to us? Don't worry about that statement. I said it somewhat, like playfully. I am also genuinely not sure, but nonetheless, encounters with entities is quite common. Now, over the last, 10 years, I think, freebasing DMT has gotten much more sort of present, like which is to take it directly, because you have to take it, either freebase it, which is to smoke it, or inject it intravenously in order to have an experience with DMT. We have molecules in our body, we have enzymes in our body called monoamine oxidase enzymes that will break down the DMT so fast. That's why it's so short and so intense, that if we just eat it, or we even like intramuscularly inject it, we're just not going to get there. Nothing's going to happen, because it'll never reach the brain in sufficient enough levels to take us anywhere, because the body breaks it down really quickly, which is why freebasing it, smoking it, or injecting it is the only way to get this full experience, intravenous injection, which I don't recommend. I don't recommend any psychedelics. I'm just telling you about these things, guys. Like, don't think that I'm recommending any of it. Should have put that at the beginning. Maybe I'll quickly cut this in at the beginning. Not recommending psychedelics here, guys, gals, others. It wasn't particularly popular, from what I understand, in the 60s, when psychedelics were kind of like wilding out, prior to the criminalization. But it has gotten more popular in the last 10 or 15 years. And I think a lot of that has to do with the underground culture, underground discussions, and the descriptions of how this crazy experience and what it seems to offer. And also with the ongoing sort of development of technologies like vape pens, where you can buy DMT in vape pens now, making it much more accessible. But arguably, more people know about DMT not because of the freebase DMT experiences, but because of ayahuasca, because of the global phenomenon of ayahuasca. Now, the reason I say that it's because of ayahuasca is because DMT is present in ayahuasca. It is the DMT that makes this incredible experience, the visual aspects of the ayahuasca experience. So first off, what is ayahuasca? So ayahuasca is a traditional sacred beverage used by various indigenous cultures in the Amazon rainforest for at least centuries. It tastes something between just like raw plant matter, sewage, and lightning, depending on the brew. And it is used in these sacred ceremonies. It is a combination of a vine called Banisteriopsis caapi, or the ayahuasca vine, and a leaf. Generally, this is the basic two ingredients: a leaf called Psychotria viridis, or trichruna, and the leaf contains DMT. The vine contains inhibitors to monoamine oxidase, meaning that when we drink it, it blocks the enzymes that would prevent DMT from being orally active, which makes it so that instead of this being something that you smoke in order to be in another space for about 5 to 10 minutes, it is something you can drink, and it takes you into this space for 5-ish hours. Generally, and I think rightfully, ayahuasca is used in sort of heavily structured ceremonial settings as a religious drink, although it is increasingly being sort of used and promoted as a therapeutic beverage as well. So this has exploded around the world. There are people drinking ayahuasca in traditional, non-traditional, and mixed religious contexts, from California to England to China, and even mixed groups of Muslim, Jewish, and Christians drinking together in the West Bank. I did a whole podcast with Antoine Saka and Lior Roseman talking about the incredible healings that are happening. This was well before the current sort of war undergoing in that area right now. But it has exploded all around the world. There are even three major religions, at least two major religions that utilize ayahuasca as their sacrament, the UDV and the Santo Daime, both of which have international representation. And the research, both anecdotal and sort of clinical scientific, shows that it has incredible antidepressant effects and even long-standing positive effects on neurological health. So the allure of ayahuasca and the positive benefits it offers has resulted in it spreading all over the world for good, perhaps also for ill. I'll let you decide. And arguably, that's how most people know about DMT, if they know that DMT is in it. So in research, what we know about DMT presently is its rapid onset and short duration makes it ideal for controlled research settings and potentially for therapeutic use. With psilocybin, we're looking at 5-ish hours, and you really have to be holding that person for 5-ish hours. With LSD, you're looking at 10 hours. There's a lot of time that goes into that. Now, arguably, there's a lot more work that can be done in 10 hours than in 5 minutes. But the fact that DMT is only a 5-10 minute experience makes it ideal for therapeutic use if we're trying to minimize the amount of time we have to be investing in that person, because professional service costs money. And also in research settings, it costs less to do this research. Now, also, what's very interesting is that, of course, DMT is quite unique. The effects of DMT on the brain and how it takes us into altered states of consciousness and what it's showing us about the neurological correlates of consciousness is incredibly interesting and is presently being researched, especially by the main researcher that comes to mind is Chris Timmerman. I've had him on the show as well. Do a little link. But I haven't had him on the show in a while, and his work is just expanding, and it's incredible to watch. So other research is that we have some research right now suggesting that it could be effective for depression, and then also neurological rehabilitation, particularly after stroke or cardiac arrest. And this is because it has an anti-inflammatory, neuroprotective, and neuroplastic effects. So what that means is that it reduces inflammation in the brain, which inflammation and oxidative stress in the brain, which causes neuronal death, is a significant contributor to what earlier described as secondary injury from concussion, but can also be present after cardiac arrest and stroke, which can cause, at the very least, the minimizing of rehabilitation's potential, but at worst, further damage and neuronal death. When we can reduce that inflammation, we can increase the likelihood of rehabilitation. From a neuroprotective standpoint, we're talking about protecting from oxidative damage, protecting for further stresses on the brain. And when I say neuroplastic, I'm talking about the ability to remap new networks to compensate for the damaged or lost neurons. Seemingly part of why DMT can do that is uniquely because of its effect on sigma-1 receptors. I'll leave you to research that if you are more interested, because I don't entirely know much past what I just said there with respect to sigma-1. And here's one of the editorial breaks we're going to do, and I'll be right back. Okay, so the next one we're going to talk about is MDMA. MDMA again, or not again. MDMA is not in the splitter category. We're including MDMA in the lumper category as a psychedelic. MDMA stands for 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine, and yes, in fact, it is a methamphetamine molecule, which we'll talk about in a second. Structurally, it's very different, extremely different from psilocybin or DMT. Totally different molecular structure, totally different effects. Rather than an indole ring, its core is a benzene ring with a 2-carbon chain and amino group. It is what's called a phenethylamine molecule, where psilocybin, DMT, tryptamine alkaloids, MDMA, phenethylamine. The molecular structure of this molecule allows for a lot of potential alterations, which is incredibly interesting. And I mean this, the phenethylamine molecule. For example, mescaline, which is another phenethylamine psychedelic, which is not something we're talking about today, but has an incredible, interesting history. How Alexander Shulgin, famous chemist, managed to create over 200 different psychedelic molecules from just subtle variations of mescaline alone. Not sure that has anything to do necessarily with MDMA, but it's an interesting point. So MDMA is a phenethylamine, and other phenethylamines that you might know of include the endogenous catecholamines such as dopamine and norepinephrine, but it also includes drugs like amphetamine, which is obviously related to methamphetamine, methylphenidate or Ritalin, if you know that brand name, bupropion or Wellbutrin, pseudoephedrine, as well as, like I said, mescaline and its many analogs. So MDMA is not considered generally a psychedelic outside of people just saying psychedelic medicine, psychedelic research, psilocybin, MDMA. Generally, it's tends to be referred to as an entactogen. It is one of a small but growing set of molecules that would qualify as entactogens, such as MDMA, but then you also have, I believe, 5-ATB, 4-MMC, 3-MMC, and MEAI, for example. There's just like a lot of different variations of these things that we call entactogens. Entactogens comes from the Greek en, meaning within, tactus meaning touch, and gen as in generating. So this term, entactogen, coined by researcher David Nichols in 1986, effectively means generating the experience of touching within. It is to sort of like increase our sense of being in touch with ourselves, with each other, generating a sense of being in touch. MDMA does target serotonin, similar, both DMT and psilocybin target serotonin, but in a totally different way. As opposed to generating, impacting with the 5-HT2A receptor, oh my goodness, there's a giant, such distraction. There's a giant mosquito in my room that hopefully does not bite me while I'm focusing. Hopefully it doesn't get in on the skin while I'm engaged in the task positive network on a different topic or a different focus. Yes. Okay. So instead of interacting with the serotonin 5-HT2B to 5-HT2A receptor, MDMA targets the SERT gate. So the SERT gate is basically the part. Okay. So in a neuron, we have the axon and we have the synapse, and we have this sort of like, I hope this is right. You have to pardon me, but nonetheless, we have this little pocket. If you imagine, if you're just listening to this, I've got my one hand open like a C and my other hand like a fist, and the C sort of reaches over the fist, and the gap between the fist and the open hand, the C, that's called the synaptic cleft. Molecules, neurotransmitters, neuromodulators, molecules come out into the synaptic cleft through these little vesicles. And when they're in there, they're able to sort of bind into little sites that influences the firing of that neuron. They get released into the synaptic cleft, and then there are aspects of the neuron that then sweeps it up. It cleans them out of the cleft. So that they can get what's called like reuptaken, brought back in towards the receptacle to be reused again. And the SERT gate is part of that process. It's part of like cleaning up the excess serotonin so that there's not too much in the cleft and so that it could be reused. MDMA reverses that function, and instead of cleaning up the serotonin, it creates, it basically pushes it out, it just squeezes all that serotonin out of these little vesicles and makes it so that it can't be brought back in. So what that effectively results in is a massive increase in serotonin in the synaptic cleft, meaning that we basically get high on massive serotonin. Simultaneously, as a methamphetamine molecule, there also a similar thing is happening with both dopamine and norepinephrine. So with dopamine being kind of like the molecule of more, like the molecule of craving, of seeking, of like desiring, of like getting into a thing, of like wanting to basically seek and find. And norepinephrine is the molecule of go, and serotonin maybe as I don't know how to describe that, but you have this wash of these three predominant neurotransmitters, neuromodulators in high amplitude. as a consequence of MDMA's activity, where what makes MDMA unique to methamphetamine is the presence of these massive heights of serotonin. So, what does MDMA do? And I'm going to read a little bit more off my notes here in this one, so you have to pardon me. But MDMA has a tendency to make us feel good, like really good, really, really good. And not just our emotional feelings, but our tactical sensations. Touch can be dramatically heightened to the point where everything we touch feels really good, and we just want more of that touch. This can include physical touching, such as like if you've ever met someone that's high on, I should clarify. Let's go back a bit, and I'm going to talk about this. So MDMA also is the primary ingredient of what's called ecstasy. Ecstasy is usually a blend of different molecules, which should theoretically have MDMA in it, but not always. And then also another stimulant and maybe some other stuff. And they're usually sold in pressed tablets. The bottom right photo here, you see from the DEA, they have a picture of some ecstasy tablets, often used in party settings. So coming back to that, if you've ever met someone at a party, for example, that was high on MDMA or high on ecstasy, you might have noticed them like really wanting to give you a hug. There's like a strong desire to like be in physical contact because it feels so good, or to be touching soft things, soft pillows or blankets, or cuddling stuffies or whatever it is. We have this increased we have the increase of tactical sensations feeling very good, which includes physical touching, but it can also include non-physical touching, as in like touching the beauty of a plant with your vision, or touching the emotional tone of the music that you're listening. So we're not just like, ooh, that feels really good on my skin, like that blanket feels really good on my skin, but that music feels really good on my soul. Like it just, like everything, the tactical feelings are all just sort of generated, heightened. And it has a particular quality to it. It has what, I think is fairly well described as a kind of love energy, where we find ourselves deeply loving whatever and whomever it is that we are engaging. We love that music. We just love this pillow. We just love ourselves. And we just love even aspects of ourselves that normally we dislike. Like I look in the mirror and normally I have issues with my body, but on MDMA, I look in the mirror and I say, I just love you so much. I love my body. I'm so sorry that I've always been hard on you. Like we are able to just like be in deep love with things, even to the point of this sort of like surrendering to just being in love and loved by the universe, to being sort of washed in just like love with a capital L, permeating our entire being and generating incredible sense of gratitude for being alive. These are all kind of possible with MDMA. And because it's not just this deeply loving energy, but because we have this high impulses, this sort of like push of the norepinephrine and this like desire of the dopamine, it's not just that we feel increased love, but we actively love. We want to love. We want to sort of like, if it's a person, we want to actively love that person. We want to listen because we want them to feel how much we love them and are listening. And we want to tell them how much we love them. We want to share that, which is where like the I really want to give you a hug energy comes from. And this is not necessarily sexual. There can be very incredible sexuality feelings. But generally it's very sensual. And oftentimes, even when they are sexual, especially males, can't really do anything about it just because things won't fire at attention necessarily. So what ends up happening generally is this incredibly close sensual state, what some people call being something like in the post-orgasmic state, with no explicit desire or capacity for sexual engagement. And this is something that we could share with another person, or anything that we're engaging it with. Sorry, I'm going on for a long time. I'm running out of steam here, guys. This loving energy, this desire to move in, desire to have people come into us emotionally, is also related to our boundaries. MDMA produces an increase in our perceived sense of safety and a decrease in our perceived sense of danger. I want to clarify this for a second because it's often misunderstood that safety and danger are related in like linear ways, that the increased presence of danger reduces our sense of safety, and the increased sense of safety is relative to a decreased presence of danger. That's not true. They're separate things. A sense of safety is how we feel, right? And danger is about what's actually present, what is actually a threat, perceived threat or otherwise. So, for example, I could be on the highway. The highway is very dangerous, right? If I'm going, 100 kilometers an hour and there are cars all around me going faster than that, and these things are all little death machines, one wrong move can completely end the lives of at least one, if not many, many people. It's incredibly dangerous to drive on the highway, but most people also feel really safe on the highway. And simultaneously, people could be in a scenario where they go into a room full of people and everyone there, nobody there is a danger to them. Not in the slightest. Not a single person in any way is a danger to them, but they feel incredibly unsafe. Right? So this is what I mean by it's not so linearly tied between safety and danger. But MDMA can increase our sense of increase our sense of safety and decrease our perceived sense of danger. So things that we would normally perceive as dangerous, we don't feel are as dangerous, and we have an increased sense of safety. Now, what that allows for is it makes it so that there's a decrease in our boundaries. Normally, we would hold certain boundaries because of how our sense of safety or our sense of danger, especially emotionally, and that when we're on MDMA, those boundaries can dissolve, and we're basically able to be and feel closer with others and with ourselves than we would normally allow ourselves to be. That we would, in general, maybe we're more closed off and we're going to be more open with other people. Now, I want to bring in that, okay, actually, we're going to talk about this in a second with respect to how all of this plays out in its role in therapy. This closeness, this loving energy and sharing impulse with others is an important part of MDMA, as it's often considered a relational medicine. Whereas compounds like psilocybin can be relational, they can include interacting with others or being in relational dynamic with the universe or the plant or so on. They're often very internal experiences. And there are times during that experience where it's incredibly difficult to communicate at all, like even to formulate what we're experiencing in words, let alone share it and communicate it with another person. MDMA can be an internal experience, but it thrives under conditions where we can talk and we want to share and we want to engage with other beings, be that person a therapist or other people, or in the instance of wanting to have like a deeply relational experience with various parts of ourselves. Now, therapeutically, we have what's called MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. It almost got legalized in the US recently, but there was some issues with the research and sort of methodology that led the FDA not to approve it. That's a bigger topic for now anyways. But what we do know is that it is historically was used before it was criminalized, and we'll talk about that in a bit, in couples therapy. Now, the reason why it was so good in couples counseling is because the boundaries are down, and what we normally hold ourselves back from acknowledging in ourselves and seeing in the other or seeing in our own behavior. Sorry, I'm half reading my notes, half talking. I'm getting quite tired now. My brain's starting to, it's 11 a.m. and I'm sundowning. When we are when we're under the effects of MDMA, if you can imagine being in a relationship, maybe you've been in this before, either intentionally or unintentionally, be it by circumstance or history or whatever it is, we can put up walls with each other, and all relationships experience conflict, right? And sometimes conflicts can be resolved. Always conflicts can be very generative. They can deepen our love and our intimacy and our trust with each other if we navigate them well. But if they don't get navigated well, they can start to put up these walls, and they can become almost constant or irretractable. We get stuck in these conflicts. Our walls are so hard up against the other person that we can't even talk, let alone reconnect with why we even care about being in a relationship with them. When we're under the effects of MDMA, there's this opportunity for those walls to come down and for us to really talk with each other again. Like in a couple's situation, it's an inclination not only to let that other person in, but to let ourselves see the aspects of how we were contributing to that situation that we didn't want to. And it can be done in a way that infuses that interaction with love, reminds us that we love this person, that it's our love for them that makes working this out worthwhile, while pharmacologically we're also supported in actually working it out. Not just because we're able to listen, not just because we're able to listen and receive and look at ourselves, but we're able to reveal. It increases a term I got from a group called the LSA, the Liminal Space Agency, and kind of a community organization here in where I live in Kitchener-Waterloo. It can increase the talk about ability of things. And if it's mentionable, it's manageable is a totally different terminology or different phrase, which is where we can now see its benefits in couples therapy. We're safer to open to ourselves and open ourselves to our partner. And we're able to talk about things, process things that we otherwise would have been closed off against. And all of this is infused with that love energy of MDMA. And in that, it's like you want to hug them, you want to hold them, you want to love them, you want to tell them about yourselves, you want to hear about them, and you want to share openly in your love with them, while you also process what could be incredibly difficult or challenging conversations that otherwise would have been inaccessible and perhaps otherwise would have been the end of the relationship. Now, that's also one of the reasons why, 2 points here. One, it's one of the reasons why it's probably not a good idea necessarily to have deep, focused MDMA sessions with someone who you're only just recently dating or seeing, because it can give you a real distorted sense of how close and intimate you really are, which is not necessarily to the relationship's benefit. The ability to hold that kind of vulnerability and intimacy is best served by the establishment of a kind of trust between you that can only be earned through time and work. It can't, that if we flood it with too much vulnerability and intimacy too quickly, the sort of what I like to call the trustworthiness bridge that we build between us through exchanges of trust and trustworthiness creates a wider, deeper, stronger bridge to hold our vulnerabilities and intimacies. And if we haven't built that, when we start flooding it all in there, well, that bridge can collapse and the relationship can collapse. If we, for example, take MDMA, we can have the illusion that that bridge is really strong and deep, but it was actually bolstered by this molecule. And when that molecule is not there, eventually it's all going to collapse if we're not careful. Not definitely, but it's still something to be careful about. Now, with respect to MDMA in post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, this is where most of its research is now. Now, the data that I'm about to share is the data that ended up being contested. So this is real, like, grain of salt stuff. But it seemed as though the MDMA sessions they were sending or giving people, which is basically under the effects of MDMA, they're going through a kind of psychotherapeutic process. From what I understand, it was very closely related to internal family systems, where they were changing how they related to themselves and their past events and the trauma and so forth. That participants who otherwise were suffering from what's called treatment-resistant PTSD, which, terrible terminology, it infers that the person is resistant to treatment rather than the treatment is ineffective. But these are people who tried basically everything and nothing worked. And 70% of those participants no longer met the PTSD criteria after 2 MDMA-assisted therapy sessions, compared to about 32% of people in conventional therapy. So with respect to PTSD, the sense of safety that MDMA and the sense of love that can allows us to enter into the traumatic experiences that are normally too too soon, too fast for us to enter into. And there's a defensive response, an anxiety response, a non-constructive response when we, touch those traumatic experiences. And so we're able to go into that and be more receptive to ourselves, to that experience, to carrying energy flowing from ourselves or from beyond us, or to be able to work with the therapists in ways that allow us greater access to these traumatic memories such that we can process them. And again, to infuse all of that with loving energy and loving impulse, not only towards ourselves, but in the context of PTSD now, towards ourselves in the form of compassion or forgiveness, or even compassion, forgiveness to those who harmed us. And as you can imagine, that could be quite helpful in resolving trauma. Now, with respect to the history of MDMA, it was first synthesized by Anton Kolisch at Merrick in 1912. It was rediscovered by chemist Alexander or Sasha Shulgin in the 70s, who I just mentioned previously, who did all those remix molecules of mescaline. And along with his wife, Anne, they helped popularize its use among couples therapists and therapists. And eventually it made its way in the party scene, where it started getting blended with other substances like press pills, which we call ecstasy. And it actually played an incredible role in the development of rave and EDM culture in the 80s and 90s. In fact, like plur, peace, love, unity, and respect. If you imagine when you have sometimes more than hundreds of people all in one space just listening to dance music and they're all on MDMA, you can imagine things go a lot better than when that's happening and everyone's on alcohol, for example. And I think that was a significant contributor to concepts like peace, love, unity, and respect, which is a really sort of central theme in rave, at least classic rave culture. It was criminalized in the mid-1980s, right in the middle of a lot of very important research that was underway at the time. Okay, you might have noticed a little cut there. I started to fade. I have post brain injury. I have limited resources cognitively. So at some points I start to get confused and start to not understand what I'm saying or thinking and need to take a rest. And that is what I did. I took a rest. I drank some coffee, and I was going to stop at MDMA, between MDMA and Ibogaine, but I'm going back. I'm cutting away from some of the stuff that you would have just heard because I was fading and poorly describing things. So near the end of talking about MDMA just then, I pulled up Rick Doblin. So Rick Doblin's on your screen now. And he is behind the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies. MDMA has been incredibly important for the progression of psychedelic medicine in research right now, be it psilocybin, LSD, DMT, all these things. They're finding their way in a lot of ways because of the work that the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies started doing quite a long time ago with their first focus on MDMA. Now, MAPS is not the end-all, be-all of what's bringing the psychedelic renaissance, as it is called, the psychedelic resurgence into the modern world, modern day, but they have been a significant contributor, and Rick Doblin in particular, because of his advocacy work and because he was, I believe, founder of MAPS. MAPS and Rick Doblin are contentious these days. It turns out everything that has any significant impact in this world has contentious figures and organizations in the mix of it. So I'll leave you to do that research if you like, but we can definitely say that MDMA has played a very important role in the progression of psychedelic research right now and the changing landscape of how it is seen in science and in medicine, psychedelics in general. And Rick Doblin has been an important contributor to that work with MDMA and through MAPS, having been there at the criminalization of MDMA in the 80s and still working now to forward its legalization. So that is the end of MDMA. If my tone has changed, it's because I'm still coming back from the little rest I needed to take, and I'm still waiting for this next coffee to take hold, for this alkaloid to interact with my nervous system by mimicking adenosine blocking, selectively blocking adenosine receptors in order to trigger the experience of wakefulness. Okay, or maybe it's like to reduce sleep pressure, along with all the dopaminergic effects. I'm not a specialist in caffeine. I mean, in enjoying it, certainly. In describing its neuropharmacology, mid, you could say. Before we get into the next one, which is going to be Ibogaine. Is it Ibogaine? It's ketamine. Before we get into ketamine, I want to take a second to thank my patrons on Patreon. Patreon is an online platform where people who care about a particular creator's work can contribute directly to the production of that work. Patreon does take a cut, such is life, but it has been through Patreon predominantly that I have been able to fund this work, fund the podcast, fund my research, fund my writing, fund me doing what I hope you experience as positively contributing to the psychedelic landscape and positively contributing to people's lives on the direct basis with what I share about myself and what I share through the podcast, the things that I feature, and the conversations that I'm trying to generate in the field of our minds and in the field of culture. I genuinely want to leave whatever slice of the world I'm in better off because I was in it, because I made an effort to do good in the world in the only way that I understood, or in the ways that I progressively learned to be goodness in this world, and with the particular skills and capacities that I have, the little niche that I'm able to fit in, the small little sort of pocket of life that I seem to fit within. And this is how I do that. And it's not cheap on time or energy or on money, finances. Everything costs more and more money all the time. And since my brain injury, everything costs more and more in time and cognitive resources. So through Patreon, I've been able to earn an income through doing this work. And my patrons on Patreon are people who choose to say, hey, here's some money for doing this thing that you just give away for free to everyone. Here's some money to help recoup the costs of doing that, and to hopefully, in time, earn enough to, retire. I eventually will be 60 and 70. I'd like to have something there, or certainly in the instances of the last few years, to have some kind of surplus that allows me to adapt when things go haywire, when somebody runs a red light and hits me, for example. So to pay for the consequences of these things. So thank you, patrons, so much. I just deeply appreciate that you continue to have faith in me and to invest in me, even as economically things are complicated for everyone. I couldn't be more grateful. If you listening now find any kind of value in this show, please do contribute financially. Again, this takes a lot of time and resources and money to produce. And if you feel like it's something you want to reliably help create and fund in this world, you could become a patron on patreon.com/James W. Jesso. As little as a couple of dollars a month. Would love that. More if you've got more, feel more is deserved. Or even if you just found value in this one, just leave a one-time PayPal donation of any amount. I would really appreciate that. So the people on the screen, whose names are on the screen here on YouTube, are patrons that give significantly or give, of a certain dollar amount, some of which for a long time. I mean, significance is really, dependent relative to a person's financial situation. $2 can be quite significant for an individual. The people who's listed on the screen here on YouTube give of a notable dollar amount, and some of which for a long time. So the credits there are thank you to them. And links to oh my God. Wow, that nap might not have been enough to get my brain back on, but we're here. Here's hoping that this whole lecture thing doesn't fall off a cliff from here. Yes, links to all of this will be in the description to this. And thank you so much for supporting the show, supporting me, and supporting this work. And let's get back into the lecture here. Oh, blessed be the lords of coffee. Okay, so ketamine. I am going to butcher this molecule's name. 2,2-chlorphenyl 2-methylamino cyclohexane 1,1, also known as ketamine, is a dissociative anesthetic with psychedelic-like effects. So ketamine is in that lumpers category. Even the experiences itself of what we would call it psychedelic-like effects are not particularly akin to that of, say, psilocybin, but it definitely fits the category of altering consciousness into other states of reality, seemingly. Um, it is neither tryptamine nor phenethylamine. It has a distinctive cyclohexane ring with a chlorinated phenyl group attached. It's actually much more closely related to PCP, phencyclidine, I think that's PCP, or colloquially called angel dust back in the 90s at least, and is actually, I believe, an analog of PCP. Now, it is a very important medicine, actually. It's considered a staple medicine by the World Health Organization. So, this is because ketamine, as a dissociative anesthetic, is actually very safe. By this, I mean that when we consider things like fentanyl or morphine, or, oh, what's the other one called? It's not bupropion. Anyways, there are other anesthetics that definitely anesthetize a person and make them unconscious, but the risk of respiratory suppression or other serious medical events under the effects of these anesthetics is significant. Ketamine does not have those same risks, at least purely on its own. There are risks when it's combined with other respiratory suppressant or depressant agents. But you can generally safely give ketamine to someone who is on the battlefield and otherwise going to die. For example, in World War I, they gave people morphine. People died from the morphine directly. In Vietnam, for example, they gave ketamine and people would not die from the ketamine. They'd probably die from their limbs being forcefully removed by explosions, perhaps, but it wasn't the ketamine that suppressed their respiration. What makes it a staple medicine is that it's also very cheap to produce and safe to administer. So the World Health Organization considers it a staple medicine for third world countries because it is such an accessible emergency medicine. It makes it safe for use in people with compromised medical or physiology, makes it safer, for elderly people and even for children. Rumor has it that China tried to get it broadly criminalized around the world as a part of the sort of UN sort of agreement on what drugs would be criminalized, and it was shot down because the World Health Organization saw it as such an important medicine. The rumor is that China was trying to do this because of problems they have with ketamine in their country, ketamine addiction. Don't know that to be true. You can look it up if you like. But nonetheless, it is considered as a staple medicine because of its safety and efficacy. A lot of people call ketamine a horse tranquilizer, right? And this is because they misunderstand that although ketamine is used in veterinary medicine, again, because it's a very safe and cheap and accessible anesthetic, that it must be like it gets stolen from the vets and you're actually getting high on horse tranquilizer, but it as a dissociative anesthetic is used broadly across a number of different domains. Okay, so getting into ketamine's mechanisms of action, this is pretty complex, and I'm going to do my best to describe it. But unlike DMT, psilocybin, MDMA, ketamine doesn't impact serotonin. I mean, it impacts a number of different neural systems, but its predominant effect is what's on the NMDA receptor, which is a part of the glutamate system. Glutamate is our main excitatory neurotransmitter. It tells the brain to go. Secondary to glutamate would be GABA. GABA tells the brain, don't go. So that would be our main inhibitory neurotransmitter. When ketamine binds to the NMDA receptor, it makes it so that in certain areas of the brain, there's an increase in glutamate. But the area that it binds to is related to the GABAergic system. So it blocks the inhibitory effects of GABA. So it increases the excitatory neurotransmitter in the prefrontal cortex while also inhibiting the inhibitory effect of GABA. You would think that would lead to excessive excitation, but it seems to make it so that the brain can no longer communicate with itself. The way that it selectively acts is that it creates a disrupted connectivity. And since our ability to be consciously aware is dependent upon our brain communicating with itself in a particular way, it simultaneously increases mental activity while decreasing the sort of by also detaching the brain's connection with the body. This also has to do with how ketamine affects the thalamus, which is kind of like the brain's relay station. So it cuts off information flow to the cortex from the body. It disconnects the body's experience from the brain's experience while also ramping up the brain's, like the prefrontal cortex sort of mental experience. So we have this increase in sort of subjective experience and a decrease in that experience being tied to the sensations of the body or even the experience of the body. So you get this disconnection. At doses high enough, the disconnection is so dramatic that the conscious awareness is suppressed completely. And despite the fact that there might be increased glutamatergic activity, we have no conscious awareness at all because we are so like the disconnection becomes so great. At lower doses, we get this weird alteration of the experience. We'll talk about it in a bit. But at anesthetic doses, we get completely unconscious. However, because of this weird combination of increasing mental activity while detaching or disconnecting it from body experience or sort of like signals from the physical body, at slightly sub-anesthetic doses, we have the experience of entering domains of experience entirely defined by just mental processing rather than any kind of like connection between our sensory environment and mental experience. So again, very complex. I don't know how well I described it there, so I'll let you neuropharmacologists correct me in the comments. But this is the primary action of ketamine through the NMDA receptor to disconnect mental experience from the body, sometimes to the point of unconsciousness, but just before unconsciousness to the point of dramatically increasing mental experience while completely detaching or dissociating it from physical experience or the experiences of the body. Now, the experience of ketamine itself is interesting, very interesting. It can range from mild to significant distortions or dissociation from the body. So it can alleviate pain, alter physical sensation. It can create a strong sensation of feeling floaty or even a bit drunk with some mild perceptual distortions. One of the aspects, and what's interesting about this is one of the aspects of it as a lumbered psychedelic experience is that whereas things like psilocybin or LSD or MDMA or DMT tend to increase our emotional experience, ketamine decreases our emotional experience. Our emotions and our feelings are tied to our physical sensations. They're tied to the signals coming from our physical body into the mental or our mental experience up in the brain. It's hard not to separate. Like it's hard not to make this weird separation between brain and body. I mean, brain is obviously a part of the body, but this disconnection that happens makes it so that although we have increased mental activity, these incredible experiences, and even there could be the sense that there are particular feelings involved, we don't actually feel them so much. We're dissociated from our feelings. This makes it ideal sometimes for certain forms of therapy where you might want to go in and work on a thing that normally is the feelings of it are too much. But when we're on a small enough a dose of ketamine or the right dosage, we can get into it where the feelings no longer flood us. Now, as this gets into higher doses, the detachment between the physical body's sensation or perception of the surrounding kind of environment and the mental experience can become so dramatic that we enter basically phenomenological worlds entirely untethered from the senses of our physical body, generating out of body experiences and seemingly entry into different realities, ones that can but don't always include autobiographical material, which means we can enter into other realities that have no sort of sense of being related to our history or emergence from our memories or anything like that. We're just in totally different worlds, spaces with possible angles, and even at certain points where even the sort of relative position of like a single point of consciousness to the dimensional, like the dimensions of the space that we're in are untied, and there is no singleized local state of consciousness, at least local state of awareness, at least as I've had it described to me. Nonetheless, when we go into these higher doses that are just below the dosage that would create unconsciousness, that is when we enter into what one would call a peak psychedelic experience on ketamine, what other people call the K-hole. K-hole has a derogatory term because it really does feel like you're sinking out of experience. You like physically, if you've ever seen somebody go through it, it looks like they're just sinking away. But generally it's called a K-hole because most people who are using ketamine recreationally are using it trying to like just almost like being on trippy cocaine or something. Like it's stimulating, it's got a dopaminergic effect. It kind of like engages you, makes things kind of weird, and you want to like get around and talk with people and your body feels all strange. Like I had one person describe it to me as like 6 beers on the tip of your pinky finger. And then they take too much and they sink away, and it's a bad thing. They call it a K-hole. But people who are more psychonautic recognize that this is when well contained and you're ready to go in there, entering into this K-hole is something like entering into the peak psychedelic experience of ketamine. Now, one might wonder what its, medical use is. Okay, so we have its use as a dissociative anesthetic, as a staple medicine. And we have the realization that it can create these weird psychedelic type experiences. And I already alluded a little bit to how it could be used in therapy. But what was really curious is that despite this ketamine being first synthesized in 1962 as a safer alternative to PCP, which was being used as an anesthetic at the time, it was approved for medical use as an anesthetic in 1970. Like I said, became widely used as a battlefield anesthetic in the Vietnam War. It always had this recognition of the psychedelic effects, which kind of got it popular and underground use, but generally medically, it was still used as an anesthetic. This is until in the early 2000s, they discovered that a dose of ketamine can temporarily lift treatment-resistant depression and associated suicidality within hours. What this means is that they discovered, that somebody who was suicidally depressed and could find no relief elsewhere, somehow, given a dose of this anesthetic drug, even at doses that don't produce anesthesia, alleviated their depression and suicidality, sometimes for up to 2 weeks before it comes back. Now, besides the fact that this created an opportunity to start exploring ketamine as an antidepressant drug, it opened an entirely new perspective on depression treatment. This is because initially, depression was generally seen as, if you've ever heard like the serotonin theory or serotonin depletion or inadequate serotonin theory of depression, effectively that there's not enough serotonin in the brain. That's why people are depressed. And so they give them SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which is selectively targeting specific serotonin receptors to prevent them from reuptaking, which is to clean up the serotonin molecules out of the synaptic cleft. If we inhibit that, we increase serotonin in the brain. They see that you increase serotonin in the brain with these drugs, and people are less depressed in a month or two time. That goes to stand that, oh, it must be the increased serotonin that creates the antidepressant effects. Now, lots of issues with SSRIs and their effects on depression can be anywhere from totally ineffective to very effective to, effective, but with side effects that make it people wonder whether or not it's, price is worth its gain is worth the cost. But that aside, there's increasing evidence that this theory of serotonin being the predominant driver of depression is actually false, and that the benefits on depression we're seeing from SSRIs are not from the serotonin, but as a secondary effect of what the increased presence of serotonin seems to be doing to neural functioning in general, perhaps through glutamate, perhaps through neuroplasticity, perhaps through the reduction of stress. Who knows? Either way, ketamine introduced this whole new way of thinking about depression. This drug it has effects on serotonin, but it's not a serotonergic drug. It is a drug that is through the glutamate system producing like anesthesia, dissociative anesthesia. And even if there's nothing about the experience at all that relates anything to depression, people can have reduced depressive symptoms for weeks afterwards, only after a single dose. That led to a exploration of the role of neuroplasticity in depression, specifically that it seemed as though the rapid increases in neuroplasticity that the ketamine seemed to offer, and how it could help restore synaptic connections in regions like the prefrontal cortex that show atrophy in depression. It might actually be through these neuroplastic effects that ketamine is alleviating depression, at least temporarily. So out of that, and also because ketamine was already legalized, which makes it much more simple to go from it being legal to treat one condition to it being legal to treat another, rather than with MDMA or psilocybin, it is completely illegal, and now we have to justify its use broad scale, not just in different conditions. It made it so that ketamine could be researched, and researching its effects on neural tissue and on experience into other conditions. For example, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorders, even chronic pain disorders, as an adjunct to psychotherapy, or even as a just sort of on its own thing. People go in and they get their IV ketamine and they're under for an hour, and then they come back in 2 weeks when their depression comes back. On top of that, it created a whole new emergency medicine use for ketamine, which is to prevent acute suicidality in emergency medicine. So you can see here on the right of the screen, on the right of the slide, we've got S-ketamine, which is, so ketamine is, I don't remember the term, but molecules have these two sides. It's like a left hand and a right hand. When each of these sides is called an enantiomer. With ketamine, you have an R side and an S side. Similar with, if you've ever heard of Adderall. So Adderall is a brand name for a selective mixture of amphetamine, which has a D side, dextroamphetamine, and L side, levoamphetamine. And they break these two molecules apart, and they selectively add more of the dextroamphetamine to what otherwise would have been an even mix, racematic in the sort of regular amphetamine, and you get this proprietary blend called Adderall. With S-ketamine, what we have is the R and the S enantiomers broken off, and just the S side, the S-ketamine, being delivered now as a proprietary drug for the treatment of depression through this spray. Now, a lot of people, and I think rightfully so, express concern over how ketamine is finding its way in the sort of psychedelic renaissance. And it's not because people don't believe in ketamine as a potential treatment. It is questionable because the nasal spray of ketamine itself can be highly addictive, and the nasal spray is a more addictive route. The faster you can administer a drug, the higher the developments of dependency and addiction. But it's because the current regulations around ketamine, especially in the United States, make it very easy to start prescribing it for conditions that it's not approved for. And with privatized medicine, becomes easy to leverage the popularity of psychedelic medicine, psychedelic therapy, using ketamine, which is technically legal to give to people, although its efficacy long term is clearly not strong because it usually only lasts for like a week or two. Um, and you end up in scenarios where people have these boutique clinics that are charging thousands and thousands of dollars for people to go in and get their ketamine, but they'll have to just keep coming back every 2 weeks. So there's issues of dependence, addiction, profit motives. Profit motives will always be something to be concerned about in our society, at least the way that it's configured now. But these concerns are different than with psilocybin and MDMA, presently at least. So that's ketamine. You'll have to forgive me. Like I said, I'm doing my best here, but my cognitive function declines as the day goes on pretty significantly. There's a steep drop off, and I might be in it now, but I think we're going to keep going and we're going to hope for the best. First, I'll just finish this coffee. Okay, so Ibogaine. Ibogaine is a naturally occurring indole alkaloid. Like we said, an alkaloid, the indole ring is the basis for tryptamine alkaloids. Although Ibogaine has a much more complex molecular structure than the tryptamine alkaloids and has a very different pharmacology. Essentially, tryptamines are also indole alkaloids, but not all indole alkaloids are tryptamines. Ibogaine as well is also a psychedelic under the lumper terminology. Ibogaine is the main alkaloid, psychoactive alkaloid present in the root bark of the Tabernath Iboga plant. Tabernath Iboga is a plant that is predominantly present in Africa, West Africa especially. And although we're lumping it in the category of psychedelics for this discussion, it would be actually better described as a nirogen, which is a compound that facilitates dreams. And the reason for this is that, unlike the kind of like open-eyed psychedelic visual types of things that can happen when we're under the effects of something like LSD or psilocybin, I know we didn't talk about LSD, but I'm just going to assume that if you know what psychedelics are, you've at least heard of LSD. Ibogaine, and I don't know this personally because I've never experienced Ibogaine at this point in my life, seems to create these incredibly immersive worlds and these scenes that you go into that happen under closed eyes, similar to like being in a waking dream, but are only present when your eyes are closed. So this is why it might be more accurate to describe Ibogaine as a nirogen rather than as a psychedelic. But for the purposes of our discussion today, we'll call it a psychedelic. The mechanisms by which Ibogaine works is incredible. This molecule works on so many different targets in the brain. It works on serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, acetylcholine, glutamate, GABA, OCT2, ion channels, receptor tyrosine kinases, and affects each of these systems in different ways simultaneously. Like it is, it's just like an incredibly complex molecule that does things to the brain that we really don't understand yet how or why it does what it does. Nolan Williams, who I mentioned at the beginning when I started using the terminology of splitters versus lumpers, I had him on the show to talk about Ibogaine as a treatment for concussion, and we'll talk about that in a second. But he used this incredible metaphor. He said, the way that we're thinking about how molecules affect brain function is almost like a 14th century key. We think about like, oh, we use this molecule and it affects this particular neural system and it makes changes. And that we see it as relatively simple. I mean, we don't see it as simple, but like our ability to utilize molecules to affect these systems, we're thinking about it from a simple way. You think about SSRI. It's like, oh, we're going to have these effects on the brain by selectively targeting specific serotonin receptors and inhibiting a specific function in serotonin to create these effects. Okay, that's like a 14th century key. He describes Ibogaine as like an advanced modern key, which it just functions in such a complex way to produce its results that it's borderline inconceivable between the simplicity of the 14th century key and the modern key. I use the photos here that you see on the bottom right of the slide where you've got this very simple key, as you can imagine, like an old skeleton key. And on the right, you have a key for like a modern electric car, which is basically just a fob, and it's got a touch screen. And you can control the car's functions like within on the key from a distance. Like the difference between these two like these two keys and what they can do is incredible. You can almost consider it something like the difference between like picking up an old rotary phone to call on the landline and the cell phone in your pocket today. This is like the difference in how complex the mechanisms are of these molecules. Now, in terms of effects, we have closed-eyed visuals. Like I said, close your eyes and it enters into an extremely immersive and visual experience in your mind's eye, like a dream. Interestingly, with Ibogaine, with Iboga, with Ibogaine, there is what is often described as autobiographical visions, sometimes like a life review. If you've ever heard the stories of people who die and they go through a whole life review from the beginning to the end, and they go through their whole life and assess all their choices and so on and so forth, and then they come back with a new perspective, assuming they come back to tell the tale. Ibogaine seems to produce something like this. Some even say that there's a spirit there that helps guide it and kind of like informs strongly for us to accept the reality of like the consequences of our actions and choices as we go through and review our lives and the choices that we made and how they've contributed to where we are and how the role other people played and how we perceive ourselves in the world. And that this is a quintessential part of the Ibogaine experience. They can also be incredibly challenging. Like all psychedelic substances can be challenging. Even MDMA can be challenging, despite how like lovey-dovey and pleasant it can feel. It can also have overwhelming and challenging aspects. But Ibogaine is particularly uniquely challenging. It is incredibly long-lasting. We could think of LSD as lasting a very long time at like 10-ish hours. Well, Ibogaine can last 24 hours up to 30 hours, and in that time frame, any kind of movement can contribute to nausea or vomiting or just like retching and discomfort. And this can go on for a very long time. So because of this, outside of certain circumstances and cultural scenarios at very low doses, there's little to no recreational use of Ibogaine. It's predominantly used in ceremonial or therapeutic settings. And on top of that is the only psychedelic, quote, psychedelic, whose physiological effects can directly result in death. Now, it is, okay, so outside of MDMA, which could cause death in the scenario of what's called serotonin syndrome, you have too much MDMA, for example, or it's mixed with the wrong substances, and you have such an increase of serotonin that you can't regulate. You go into what's called hyperthermia. Your body can't regulate its temperature, and you basically start to burn up, and then your brain fries out and you vomit yourself to death. It's terrible. People do die that way with MDMA, and it's very sad. But with other psychedelics, sure, people could die by making terrible choices while they're under the influence, hurting themselves or walking out into traffic. But the psychedelic effects don't directly cause death. Like like the LSD doesn't kill a person. Psilocybin doesn't kill a person. Someone could die as a consequence of the choices they make on it, but it's not direct. Ibogaine isn't like that. There's a possibility that because of how Ibogaine affects cardiac functioning, it slows the heart rate down so slow, sometimes as low as 50 beats a minute. This is very slow, that if a person has a irregularity in what's called their QT interval, which is the interval between heartbeats, if there's an irregularity there, Ibogaine can produce what's called Torsades syndrome, where the heart doesn't start beating again. It slows down so much that in between beats, it just stops. Now, the actual record we have of people dying through Torsades syndrome, through Ibogaine, is sparse, and pretty much every single example was because there wasn't good medical screening in advance, or that person was already very ill, because a lot of the people who we have a history of taking Ibogaine outside of its traditional uses in Africa, which we'll talk about in a second, generally is people who are undergoing long long periods of addiction. We're going to talk about that in a sec. But nonetheless, it's the only psychedelic that can directly result in death. Something else that I wanted to mention about the experience that's unique is that on top of going through autobiographical visions, it also seems to increase, like there's a high rate of people encountering what they would call their ancestors or communication with dead loved ones. Happens on other psychedelics as well, but it seems to be something unique about Ibogaine, and that the connection with ancestors and dead loved ones is a part of this life review, unique to Ibogaine. Okay, so let's talk about Ibogaine's history. So Ibogaine's been used by centuries by the Bwiti people of West Africa in initiation and ceremonial practices. Now, mind you, they're not using Ibogaine, they're using the root bark of the Tabernacle Iboga plant. They're using Iboga, but it has been a part of their traditional history for hundreds of years. In 1901, Ibogaine was first synthesized by French researchers and was actually at one point sold as a stimulant in France in the form of what was called lambarine, pardon my pronunciation there. And speaking of recreational purposes, it was for a while sold in France as a recreational drug from 1930s to 1960s, and it was only withdrawn from the market when Ibogaine itself was made illegal by the French government in 1966. Now, when I mentioned before about how oftentimes people outside of traditional contexts who are taking Ibogaine end up being people who have spent long periods of time in addiction, this is because in 1962, a man named Howard Lotsof accidentally discovered its anti-addictive effects. Effectively, if I remember this correctly, they used heroin and they tried Ibogaine as like a new kind of drug that they wanted to like try out, that they're experimenting with. And they came out on the other side of that, where their dependence, which is physiological, their need for heroin, and their addiction, the sort of non-physiological, the psycho-emotional, social aspect of addiction, was gone. And since then, he started to offer to others, and it got to a point where it became on the underground a way in which people could get off heroin, get off opiates that they were addicted to. And even now, it is the only drug that we know of that can effectively stop opioid withdrawals within a few hours of administration. And in a supportive context, it makes it so that people come out the other side of it, for the most part, no longer physically dependent on the opiate and no longer addicted. And part of that being the life review, the autobiographical review that they go through, and how that changes their relationship to the substance. Now, this isn't a solution to addiction, but people can still go back in and end up back on heroin, of course. But it's incredible that the effects that we have, mostly anecdotally, because we don't have a lot of good medical research on its anti-addictive effects, but we have incredible amounts of anecdotal evidence on its ability to stop opioid addiction, to cease the addiction, to cease the dependence, and give people a new lease on life. And primarily, that is where Iboga, Ibogaine treatment sort of rests in the larger scheme of psychedelic research. Is mostly treatment centers that operate in countries where it's legal, where they're predominantly targeting addiction, although research into its mechanisms and different uses continues, such as with head injury, we'll talk about in a second. And of course, there's still an underground, there's still a bit of a tourist, psychedelic tourism industry for going to countries like Gabon to have what's called a traditional Bwiti initiation, non-tourism, like genuine spiritual initiation there for people who aren't necessarily African. And there's underground networks of people using Ibogaine for a more spiritual or therapeutic PTSD and so on and so forth, not just addiction. So it exists in the underground for a wide dynamic of uses, the same as ayahuasca might, although admittedly to a different degree of presence. But primarily, a lot of it is for addiction. Now, when we look at Ibogaine's medical uses, like I said, we have the anti-addictive effect in the aftermath of the Ibogaine experience. People go in addicted to heroin for 15 years and face everything in their lives that led them to that addiction and all that came out of it. And then they exit the experience physiologically cleaned of the drug and empowered to change their lives away from that addiction after only a single session. We have no other drug that does this. The best option that we have right now as a medical institution in at least North America is to help people get off opiate drugs by putting them on another opiate drug that they're dependent on, which is effectively methadone treatment. The ability to have a drug that can clear people of this addiction is incredible. It's just complicated because, well, people could die. It's a 30-hour psychedelic experience. There's a lot of complexities that prevents it from being more present in our medical institutions, despite the data that we have on it. So let's see. We've discussed non-opioid drug. It's a non-opioid drug that can stop opioid withdrawal symptoms, reverse opioid tolerance or dependency, seemingly free people of addiction. Now, the other thing that is interesting is that research in the last few years, particularly through Nolan Williams at Stanford, have found that treatment with Ibogaine can help reverse TBI, mild traumatic brain injury, or concussion. Effectively, we have these people going in, predominantly they're veterans, and they all have concussion, usually blast injury. I believe they were all in the mild category. And I want to clarify that a mild TBI, traumatic brain injury, doesn't mean mild in impact. It just means that there isn't any traumatic damage to the brain. Like a moderate to severe, you could go through a CAT scan and you could see pieces of the brain are just gone. That's a severe brain injury. You have it's moderate brain injury, you can see damage. A mild traumatic brain injury is that you can't really see the damage outside of very specialized, highly expensive equipment like a functional MRI. But you can track the damage through its functional consequences. So somebody having reduced cognitive energy or reduced ability to communicate or sensory challenges, or one of the hallmarks of TBI or concussion is not just, cognitive functional challenges, but emotional dysregulation, increased rates of depression, increased rates of suicide. It's hard to live with a brain injury in a lot of ways, especially hard that people don't really see it on the outside. Unlike a broken leg in a cast, you could tell how much that impacts someone's life. But if somebody's talking mostly normally, you have a good reason to assume that they're probably mostly fine. And that is not always the case. Anyways, try not to get too personal about this here. You have these individuals that are going in to these experiences, these people who have been with their concussion for more than 2 years, and they all through a number of different sort of surveys that would track disability status. They all qualified. This person is qualifiably disabled by their concussion. They go in, they have their Ibogaine experience, they come out the other side, same metrics, same surveys, they no longer qualify for disability. And that this sustains for at least a year. We have no other drug whatsoever. We have at best guesses and compensations that can help people after mild traumatic brain injury, after concussion, kind of get back some of their function and try to rehabilitate as much as possible. But for a lot of people, especially if they've had multiple concussions, it just gets to a certain point and it just doesn't get better. And there's nothing we can do. There's no pharmacological treatment we have to help get their brain back to healthy. And it seems like Ibogaine does this in a single session, and it sustains for at least a year. And last I heard, it was still sustained after 2 years since this research. They can even they did, like I said, very sophisticated, highly expensive imaging, functional magnetic resonance imaging that can show changes. You could see okay, here's where that injury is before the Ibogaine. After the Ibogaine, it's gone. After a single session. And we just don't have any other drug to do this. It's absolutely incredible. One of the comments I heard was something like it can de-age the brain by 2 years or 1 point some odd years as well. I'll let you just research that yourself, because it's very curious to think that if aging as a natural sort of degradation of brain function as a natural consequence of molecular operation over time, basically aging, causes this damage, and Ibogaine seems to reduce and reverse some of that damage. I mean, there's obviously the concussion stuff here, but then there's the other question of just like the idea of de-aging the brain. And most recently that I heard, at least as of last year, is that they showed it as a potential treatment for multiple sclerosis. Effectively, that Ibogaine seems to reduce the presence of the lesions that multiple sclerosis has on the brain. So multiple sclerosis generates these lesions on the brain that is a part of it as a disease, and Ibogaine seems to reduce those lesions. So here we have this molecule from this ancient plant. I mean, all plants are ancient. That has this incredibly advanced pharmacology that we're barely even, that not only have we barely scratched the surface of how it works, but like it reveals things about the interfunctionality of the brain that is, itself beyond what we already understood, pushing our understanding of basically how we can selectively target functions within the brain through pharmacology. And it does these amazing things that we have no other treatments for. Incredible. So those are the psychedelics we talked about today. We talked about Ibogaine, we talked about ketamine, we talked about MDMA, we talked about DMT, we talked about psilocybin. Couple of notable mentions that we did not talk about. Clearly, this is already a very long podcast, a very long lecture. We did not talk about 5-MeO-DMT, which is similar to NM-DMT, except it does not produce incredibly complex, vivid experiences, but instead, or like visual experiences, but instead produces what some might call like a complete absence of sort of subjective content. That instead of the highly colorful dimensional reality of other entities and beings that NM-DMT can take you into, 5-MeO-DMT seems to take people into a place where there is an absolute absence of anything. Entities, beings, even the self, that people sometimes call it the God molecule, because people enter into states where all of time collapses into one singular being that is, I am everything. I am that I am. Cool. Haven't experienced it. Seems interesting. Didn't talk about it. LSD, mentioned it a few times. Huge history, huge cultural impact. Definitely worth researching on your own. Mescaline as well. We didn't talk about mescaline as the active molecule in the various psychedelic cacti, such as mescaline. Mescaline, such as peyote, or things like San Pedro, Echinopsis pachanoi. We did not talk about salvia, 5-MeO-DMT, LSD, mescaline. These are all classical psychedelics. We did not talk about salvia, which also has psychedelic-like effects, but operates on the opioid system, in particular the kappa opioid system. And we did not talk about Amanita muscaria mushroom, a mushroom that would also not qualify as a psychedelic on the splitter terminology, but is increasingly interesting in its growing presence of use in the underground, specifically through microdosing, and some of the clinical research coming up, very sparse but early days, and its benefits on neurological function and mental health. And we didn't talk about datura, which in many ways we just wouldn't, because people don't talk about datura or what's called the tropane alkaloids or the deliriants when we talk about psychedelics, because for the most part, outside of utilizing one specific molecule out of datura, scopolamine, as a clinical model for like Alzheimer's and dementia, because it so effectively knocks out the ability to like form memories. Datura is like way out there. Like historical uses included like necrophilia and all sorts of weird stuff. Like, at least, okay, don't propagate that. This is what I understand, but I don't want to support rumors that aren't true. But nonetheless, datura is like weird, and I would only talk about it just because of how weird it is, not because it necessarily applies under psychedelics, but it does have traditional use. Now, we're pretty far in, but I want to talk quickly about why it is that psychedelics seem to have all these different effects on all these different systems. Like we talked about how Ibogaine seems to have, at least what we can see, these three potentials: addiction, um, uh, TBI, MS. We talked about ketamine with depression, and through that psychotherapy, we talked about some of DMT for depression and brain regeneration, and also psilocybin for a number of different things. But outside of this, we're learning that psychedelics seem to be able to do similar things on the output. Like they can treat similar things very effectively, and they can treat a dynamic of different things. So despite very different mechanisms underlying the different psychedelics we spoke of today, they all share common characteristics that make them able to address these so many different conditions, different mental health conditions, different neurological conditions, and supporting sometimes medically unexplainable recovery. Now, those mechanisms that are generally shared across all of them is decreases in neural inflammation. So we talked earlier about how neural inflammation can have a detrimental effect on brain rehabilitation, and it can also cause degradation of neural tissues, basically neuronal death through oxidative stress. And that all of the psychedelics seem to reduce neural inflammation, which would theoretically at least reduce damage and increase the likelihood of rehabilitation. But on top of this, they also seem to all in some way or another increase neuroplasticity and perhaps neurogenesis. Effectively, now we've sort of put the fire down, allowed rehabilitation to happen, producing further damage, protecting from further damage, while also giving on the neurological level the opportunity for people to create new pathways or utilize the pathways that are there in their firing differently to allow rehabilitation, be it through mental illness or learning how to move your arm again after stroke, whatever it might be, such that we can lay new foundations for how the brain works, such that it can not only heal itself, but we can functionally redevelop capacities in life, be them mental, emotional capacities or physical capacities. And with terms of neurogenesis, perhaps even generating new neurons in different areas in the brain, which would allow, of course, for further networking, scaffolding to happen if we have new sort of points upon which that we can link networks together, new centers for connection. They also all support psychological flexibility. We've been talking about the neurological side of things here. But on the psychological side of things, they produce the ability to think differently, to respond differently, to go in and look at aspects of ourselves or our lives or our experiences or our perspectives that normally would be locked, and shift those things to respond differently to what otherwise would have triggered a very typical response in us, to change our opinions on ourselves, to change our beliefs about ourselves, change the models with which we define what self is relative to other. This kind of psychological flexibility is absolutely necessary in making any kind of change in life, especially when it comes to making changes in our mental health, which is one of the reasons why they can be so effective in a bunch of different mental health conditions, and even on a spiritual or sort of non-psychiatric therapeutic place in our lives to make changes to better our lives and better ourselves. They also support placebo, and placebo can be a bit of a dirty word. It often is used to infer like not real or that's not actually happening. But an interview I did with Jim Fadiman and Jordan Gruber, who wrote a book about microdosing, they talk about basically how we misunderstand placebo and how important it is to understand what it is to support the placebo process. I'll leave a link. They talk about, and I agree, is that the placebo effect basically is to say, we have a positive effect that isn't necessarily tied to like physical intervention. So if someone takes a sugar pill and they get better, you don't go, oh, well, that doesn't count because it was just a sugar pill. Like we go, oh, damn, something about the change in their mind produced a positive output. To say that psychedelics support the placebo effect is not to say that psychedelics are placebo. They're clearly not. There's absolutely effects happening, and we can track them exactly to like, this is happening, and here's their outcome psychologically and neurologically. But they can support the placebo effect in the sense that the changes that they engender in neuroplasticity and neurogenesis and psychological flexibility and neuroinflammation make it so whatever it is that underwrites the placebo process that allows people to change their mind and generate greater health as a consequence, seemingly untied to the direct effects of the physical molecule that we're imbibing, it supports that, or at least it can. And finally, they all have the central mechanism of what I call experiential medicine. In this sense, we say medicine not as the molecule itself, but as like the thing that heals. Medicine is the thing that heals. And experiential medicine is the experience itself can be healing. You know, if we just completely let go of all of the neurological possibilities, all the sort of neurological correlates of healing that can happen, if I am in an experience where I am able to directly connect with, to directly experience, I'm okay. Life is beautiful. And before that, the only thing I could experience is I'm not okay. Life is awful, and I hate myself, and I hate my life, and I want to die. And I have the experience. None of the neurological stuff matters in this sense. You know, if I just have the experience, the deeply lived experience for a moment of it being absolutely true that I'm okay and life is beautiful and life is worth living, that experience itself is medicine. So that's kind of an extreme example, but all of these psychedelics share the common central mechanism of also experiential medicine, generating experiences that themselves can be healing. So, that's it. Wow, almost 3 hours, guys. Holy goodness. I hope that this didn't fall off a cliff halfway through and that you're still listening. But to summarize, psychedelic compounds, including the quasi-psychedelics of Ibogaine, MDMA, and Ketamine, are powerful psychoactive agents that are poised to transform our understanding of mental health, psychiatric medicine, and perhaps even that of consciousness itself. Close. End of lecture. 3 hours, probably. I haven't gone back to do any editing. There'll be a couple of cuts there. After my break, I really started to have a hard time with my cognitive function. So I had to repeat things, and I don't want to subject you to that. Anyways, that's it. I have been studying psychedelics very rigorously, and literally at previous times in my life before my accident, traveled around the world, learning from others, sitting in different ceremonies and different cultures, and speaking with people above and underground around psychedelic research and culture. And it is something I care about. I think it's something that's important to the world. Hopefully it was important to you. And what you heard today is a sort of little piece of what I have learned over that time, and in the hopes of sharing it with you to increase your understanding of psychedelics. Strong possibility that I got some things wrong. And if I got those things wrong, please let me know in whatever comments you can. I can't go back and change it once it's posted, but I can definitely highlight those comments and add editorial notes in the podcast's show notes, which will be at jameswjesso.com. Please check it out. And of course, things change. Science is beautiful in the sense that things that we once believed to be probably true can be later proven to be absolutely false, and new things can be true. And psychedelics are an incredibly rapidly advancing field, and I'm so excited for what's coming down the pipeline. That's all. I don't want to belabor this too much further, but if you did find this valuable, please consider engaging it online in some way, likes, comments, subscriptions, follows. I'll be posting clips of this on YouTube and on Instagram, where I primarily post clips. You can follow me through my newsletter, through Blue Sky, Twitter, Instagram. All of that will be in the show notes or in the description of this episode. I also have a Substack, which I have not started working on yet. It's there, so follow me in advance. And at some point in the future, you'll get a notification that I'm doing something that hopefully you'll think is cool. And if you don't, you can unsubscribe. No harm, no foul, right? And I think that's it. Did I already ask you to support the show? Support it financially through a donation or becoming a patron? Would love that. Makes a huge difference. And I say this at the end of all of the talks that I've given, and I think it's important. I don't say it at the end of the podcast super often, but I mean it now when I say it, and I mean it every time, even if I don't say it, which is that it is no small gift to be offered someone's attention for hours, even for 5 minutes. But if you're listening to this now and you're this far in, you offered me your attention for literally hours. Thank you. I don't take that for granted. Not only are there so many other things that you could conscientiously give your attention to, there are also even more things that are like through design attempting to steal your attention towards them. And yet you chose to listen to this. And I thank you for that. And I hope that it proves to be valuable in your life. And I hope you are well from here. And this has been episode 200 of Adventures Through the Mind. We're going back into normal interviews from here. If you like this format, you want to hear me do more of this stuff, let me know. But otherwise, we're back for some straight up regular interviews from here. And I'm rambling again. I'm tired. I think I need another nap. That's all. Thank you so much. And until the next episode of Adventures Through the Mind, take care and stay curious.